Room 1. Again, I see many names and faces that look familiar from the last session. I think, Stephen, I'm going to lead this. I'm Rich Mashiski, currently EVP of Science and Regulatory at Pharma. We will ask each of you to just quickly introduce yourself when you speak so that everybody knows who you are, even though we kind of see your name underneath your picture when you speak. Using your video, of course, I think will only enhance the experience when you speak as well. So we have 3 questions that we were asked to try and address. As we go at these, I realize that in many ways we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of the clinical trial enterprise here. In some ways, this is a more nerdy scientific kind of discussion than we had in our last opportunity, but I think it really kind of gets down to the nitty-gritty of how many of these trials are actually conducted to become more sustainable and more efficient as we move forward. So we were asked to look at several goals that the planning committee had really tried to put together, and I don't think we have a slide to address those, but let me ask just the group, do you have those goals in front of you, or would it be helpful for me to quickly run through them? There's quite a few, actually. Maybe I can just really try to summarize them quickly. So
run through them, yes. Good idea.
Yeah. One of them is to improve community engagement and transparency and user-friendliness.
Rich, sorry to interrupt quickly, but we want to identify a person who can do the readout.
Yes, please. So who's willing to be a rapporteur on this session? Mark was so good to do it last time. I think we shouldn't pick on him again if we can help it. Anybody else who's willing to act as a rapporteur? Oh, come on. It's not that hard. No one? Clay, what if I picked on you? Would you be willing to consider it?
Yes, sure. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you, Clay. You're very kind.
Clay, it is hard.
I could see that.
Well, these are at least written down for you, Clay. So as I pointed out, one of the goals is to improve community engagement, transparency, and user-friendliness. Another is to reduce the complexity and streamline the trials, as well as the startup of those trials and standardize data elements. Another is to support the regulatory robustness and flexibility with an ability to adjust according to circumstances. Another is to reduce the conduct of uninformative clinical trials, which I think we eloquently just heard about from Janet. We also, a goal was to generate a larger amount of high quality evidence at a lower cost, reduce risk aversion so we can better improve the questions that these trials try to answer, to embrace novel statistical techniques to power trials, and to connect and embed clinical care and clinical research. Those who know me know that I'm particularly nerdy about the second to the last on novel statistical techniques, which things like Bayesian approaches that I truly believe can transform how we think by changing and using all the information that's available to us instead of excluding much of the information.
And Rich, sorry to interrupt, but if people open up the chat box, what Rich just said is on there if you want to have it open in front of you.
Okay, fantastic. That helps a lot. So the first question that we are asked, what do people think of these goals? Do these goals sound like the right goals? Are there different goals that you would suggest that we need to consider? Are there some of these that seem more important than others? Let's open it up.
This is Patty Duikis from Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation. So one thing that I wanted to pick up on that Dr. Woodstock noted is the idea of these specialized CROs that would be particularly effective at conducting community-based trials. But I think we can also extend that to centers of excellence of all kinds. So the NCI through its Comprehensive Cancer Center requirements now around community and outreach and engagement are asking for the major centers to create new relationships with community-based practices and safety net hospitals such that they're carrying a greater part of the burden of clinical trials and sort of bringing their strengths together with the true strengths of the community-based practices in terms of having access to the population, being trusted by the community, so that they can really do that work well. And there's more of a backbone for the clinical trial supported by the major centers. So really looking at, within the ecosystem, who does things well, given where we want to go, and then rearranging the relationships and the kinds of support that's provided in both directions to achieve a little bit more together for these populations.
This is Keith Ferdinand in New Orleans, Tulane Cardiology. I never really could understand why, especially if it's pharma, private industry, why they should want to expand the exclusion of different populations in their trial if it makes it more costly and more difficult. And since I don't understand it, they don't either. That's why they often have to be dragged kicking and screaming into expanding their inclusion criteria. On the other hand, NHLBI and their studies proactively, if it's a disease state that is disproportionately represented in the population, will almost mandate overrepresentation. I was on a data and safety monitoring board for ALLHAT, the largest antihypertensive study ever, over 55,000 patients. It was 35% African Americans because of the overrepresentation. The SPRINT trial did the same, although it underrepresented women so much, as much because they used VA centers. It was very diverse in age, presence of renal disease, etc. So it can be done. The NHLBI does it on a regular basis with massive studies. SPRINT was over 9,000 patients. Industry doesn't do it. And I spoke about the Moderna trial. Here at Tulane, we had the J&J trial. I'm a native of New Orleans. I got good community roots. But the dean asked me like 2 weeks before the trial was almost finished, can I help get more Black patients? Nobody does it on the front end. It's not a lack of knowledge. These guidelines have been out here for years. So bottom line is, I don't know even why would they do it if they don't have to do it? It just makes the trial more hard to do. Why do it?
You're right. It does make the trials more hard to do often. And the thing is, the more diverse your trial, the harder sometimes it is to actually see your efficacy signal. And that's been, I think, an issue in the past for why they try such homogeneous populations. But I think the good news is that most pharma companies today are committing to this diversity principles. And hopefully you'll see a difference in the future that we're trying to create here.
So I have a comment. My name is Ed Seguin. I'm the CEO of a clinical trial technology company. We collect data as part of clinical trials, part of these virtual hybrid studies that we've done. We've been on a lot of the Ebola studies way back before this pandemic, and then on a number of the COVID activities now. But one of the things that I think is underutilized is clinicaltrials.gov. So companies are required to submit that data, but that data is messy and dirty, and on its own it is almost impossible for anyone to go to clinicaltrials.gov and actually utilize it. We pay tens of thousands of dollars to services that essentially clean it and strip it and try to make use of it. And it was introduced in that back in 2008. Like, if we could make some updates to the data variables that are required, to the format of those submissions, and then like put a little bit of an interface on it that allows you to segment things for exactly what this doctor is saying. If, for example, you required the distribution of patients by, various segments you could have a lot more understanding, and there would be transparency about what was the diversity in your actual trial. And so if that's something that people are committed to, then go ahead and report on it. There's already a mechanism in place to be able to do that. But the data variables on it are so messed up in terms of trying to be able to sort it, to make any kind of use of it, that no normal person is going to go to clinicaltrials.gov and be able to get anything useful out of it.
Right. So we need perhaps a better alternative for people to locate clinical trials that they might want to engage in, or a better clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah, I would say build on something that you already have. Getting something different is going to be impossible. But if you adjust and titrate how you're already using a system that is already in place, that already has regulatory backing, the pharma companies already have a process to submit there, and you're just kind of curating it more, as opposed to we put it out there and now everyone just has to submit against it. Clean up some of that data, add some extra variables that would be deemed to be important. That's, I think, an easy lift as opposed to trying to reinvent something from scratch that doesn't exist.
So one of the suggestions that I think we heard from our speakers that are embedded in these goals that were laid out here is to better align clinical care with clinical trials, and try to have them come closer together, both through the use of real-world evidence, perhaps, as part of clinical trials, the use of recruiting through clinical care records that are electronic, a number of different approaches that can better bring together the embedding of clinical care and clinical trials. Any comments there? Any people feel that yes, Erica, I saw your hand go up first. You're on mute, yeah. Thank you.
I didn't realize I was on mute. Yeah, as a patient, I am never one that is oriented towards statistics and metrics and efficiencies, and I like efficiencies, but the numbers I stay away from. What I'm always talking about is engagement and community. I really liked Janet Woodcock's proposal for the clinical trials in the community, because where the patient comes together with the concept of the trial. I mean, it's like for the patients, it's 10,000 miles away in terms of access and information about and all that. Unless you're like in a community like I created, where we have clinical trial groups that are talking about specific trials for me. But that is an online community aspect. And I liked her idea of the physical location out in the community, creating more community engagement, thus education about access and availability and how to, and my neighbor may be interested in it and that sort of thing. That's what I would really push for. And urge everybody to always remember the patient experience here. And the way to find out is to ask us.
I think really, we also heard Elliot speak to that and the importance of including the patient. I think at all stages really of clinical trials is what I'm hearing too. Andrea, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I would like to agree with Erica. I was just thinking as you were talking, I think we just need to make it the easy thing to do. So taking, the trials into the community and making it easy for patients to come in terms of, whether it's the hours of the clinic. I think somebody earlier mentioned Duke has set up a after hours clinic that's located in some of these communities. Just make it the easy thing to do. And so I'd like to stretch that to thinking about the clinics themselves. I do a lot of work here in Alabama with the Alabama Practice-Based Research Network and a lot of primary care clinics located in rural areas. And I think it's a great opportunity and can be a great infrastructure. But as we look to entities like that to increase participation, I think we really need to engage those practices, because I will say there are a lot of barriers and a lot of regulatory barriers in particular that make it very difficult for primary care practitioners in small rural areas to participate in research. And so we ask a lot of these folks who are busy, they have a lot of competing demands. And so I think, that we would be, it would be a good idea to spend some time on the front end really asking them, how can we make this easy for you guys to do? Because I think they could be great champions. They do have a lot of sway with their patients, but I think there are a lot of impediments at the same time.
Thank you, Andrea. I see Clay had a hand raised.
Yeah, I think this this alignment with clinical care really resonates with me, but it is something, again, that we've been talking about for, I don't know, at least 20 years. And so, I like what Andrea just said about let's identify the barriers. So first of all, just the promise of this, as Janet said, we have a lot of drugs in certain areas and we don't use them well. And we actually need better evidence to understand why and to improve our practices. So a learning health system view, I think, really makes a lot of sense. But also as the framework for getting trials done, identifying patients and then following them over time, an electronic health record is a really nice way to do that and exists already for most people, regardless of where they get their care, rural areas, urban areas. Yet we still don't use them effectively in clinical trials. We require parallel recruitment processes, parallel collection of data, often on paper forms, additional visits, even when the visits would be expected to be within the system. And I think that taking steps back to say, well, why? I don't think there's a financial incentive that's blocking this. I agree with Andrew, there's certain regulatory issues. I also think it's risk aversion by the pharmaceutical companies that's done it, and just a lack of innovation in the way we produce clinical trials. That we've been very, very staid in the way we move the whole organization of clinical trials forward. So I think we ought to think about, okay, we can keep saying this and write papers about it, but that has not produced change. So what is it that actively could happen, that could be recommended, that would actually produce the change to make such an obvious change? Oh, and one thing that Janet did say that I think really resonated with me was, okay, if we're going to create an infrastructure for clinical trials, what a great way to do it. The infrastructure is actually built on the backs of the existing electronic health record system, and then it comes into play as soon as we have a crisis, and then becomes the de facto system through which we do our trials. I mean, that would be a great motivation to actually push through to this next level.
So thank you, Clay. I think you started us on question number 2 about what are the interim actions that we could start to take to make some of these things happen. So I appreciate that. Do others have ideas for interim actions that we could take?
So, Rich, I think I'm missing something here. I just need help where the disconnect is. If you're studying a really common disease, hypertension, heart failure, asthma or COPD, headache, you could probably do a catchment area of 100,000 people, and that may be reasonably diverse and may have to require 3 or 4 actually separate subunits. But if you're studying a disease that's relatively uncommon, where your inclusion and exclusion criteria are such that you're not going to find these patients in an area, I don't see how this can work. I mean, this sort of idea works if we're looking at things that are really common, where you could put together an area, whether you have a lot of Asian Americans because you want to study head and neck cancer, but it seems to me that this idea suggests that we're always going to be able to find the people within these created enclaves or within these created groups that are going to give us the patients that we need to make the trials work. And I think a lot of the infrastructure that's been set up is in fact to find the patients, because we all know that patient recruitment is what limits the success of any clinical trial. And discussions we had earlier today and this one, makes sense for common things. But as soon as we get out of common things, I don't, what am I missing? Things are set up when you have uncommon things. We have a Parkinson's disease network because it's a relative, although it's a relatively common disease, it's not common enough that if you had a catchment area of X people, you're going to have enough people in that, even if everybody volunteered, to meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria, because you want your trial to be relatively clean to see if it works. So what you see what is concerning to me, and I think the reason why things haven't progressed is that when you do a trial, you're looking for specific people, and you're going to have a huge area. And so unless we can cover the whole country with these trial areas, which would be, one approach, I'm not quite sure how we could actually make it work.
I think those are great comments. Thanks very much, Jeff. I do see some comments in the chat from Julie Lau. Julie, do you want to say a few words here to the group?
Yeah, so this is actually Carolyn speaking. So we did get a question from the general public asking about whether there are sticks. I guess you could also think about incentives that might be applied to drive more engagement with diverse communities coming from specifically either NIH or FDA. That doesn't really get at the question that Jeff just raised, but certainly something for the group to discuss.
Do we really, at this time, want to continue our discussion on diversity, which is a very important discussion, but was session 1. Session 2 is more to try to discuss the things that will drive sustainability and efficiency for the clinical trial enterprise. Obviously, if everybody wants to continue on diversity issues, I'm happy to have us continue that discussion. But I think there are issues that we might still want to address here. And for example, it might be, I think, a somewhat controversial issue that Dr. Woodcock raised was this idea of a directed clinical trial enterprise, one that says, okay, we're not going to do small, crappy trials. That's a technical term. We're going to focus on trials that are adequately powered and that ask the right questions and are randomized or have the right control groups. But that sort of says somebody's in charge. So that means if somebody has another great idea but can't kind of get it through the powers that be that then control the enterprise, will that idea ever really be studied? So I don't know. I thought I'd just throw that out for a quick discussion.
I would like to start maybe just to react to that and then see what the other reactions are. The first is, I don't know if Janet was suggesting that would replace the entire existing clinical trial enterprise. I think at least what I heard was a starting point, potentially even building off of a COVID example. How do we keep platforms maybe active, going, focused on chronic disease, where it is a little bit more directed, but we're not talking about someone within government directing all clinical trials that happen across the country. But I'd love to see if there are other reactions to that. Maybe to go back to the earlier question you asked, Rich, around actions and getting clinical trials embedded in the community. A lot of it has to do with the reimbursement to providers. Is it worth it for them to participate? And we contemplate the role of CMS and providing add-on payments to providers to participate in clinical trials, similar to what's happening in the context of COVID. Of course, we have to think about the CMS Trust Fund, what is sustainable, but we have to think about it from the perspective of what's been effective with quality payment programs. Can some of that be extended to cover clinical trials as well for sustainability?
Sorry to interrupt again, 4-minute warning.
Thanks. Well, with the 4 minutes left, I know, Clay, you had your hand raised, but I would like to, no? Okay. But I would like to throw out there our last question, which is there a short-term action or a milestone that you think we could really hang our hat on to achieve some of this in the next 5 years? Anybody have some thoughts here?
Well, we certainly could, through congressional directive or the agencies getting together, create this kind of stockpile of clinical trial networks that's prepared to jump into action in an emergency, and in the meanwhile is studying chronic diseases that affect a lot of people, to address your issue, Jeff, not looking at rare cancers, but looking at heart disease and mental health issues to try to get ready. I mean, we've set up a lot of networks. We know how to do that, and focusing it specifically along the outlines of what Janet suggested, I think is we know how to do this. We can do it.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's a great suggestion. I personally continue to say that our use of adaptive approaches and not locking us into single trials, but rather using all the data in front of us with novel statistical approaches could also really help us get far more efficient and include community-based information to a much greater degree. Anything else? Other approaches? Mark? Yes.
Yeah, I guess for me, it might be useful to think about kind of how we would measure value of such a network, and whether it's going to be defined solely by fiscal value, or there are sort of fiscal impacts of having such a network. I mean, one can imagine just the readiness of kind of being able to roll out a trial rapidly would provide value. Or having a diverse populations.
Absolutely. That would certainly also increase efficiency, which increases sustainability. It's a great point. Clay, do you feel like you've gotten everything down you need? Any questions for the group need for clarity?
No, I think I mean, we bopped around quite a bit, but we covered a lot of interesting things, and I will do my best to represent the discussion.
With 1 minute left, if I could add, this is Daniel Conyos from CDRH FDA.
Please.
Two of these efforts are ongoing with collaborations with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. To your point on powering trials with statistical techniques, they released a draft external evidence methodology paper that highlights a bunch of opportunities for leveraging extant data sources for powering trials. And then also, as far as building the research network embedded in within the care, FDA CDRH is collaborating with the MDIC on the national evaluation system for health technology. So certainly there are some ongoing efforts that are kind of baking and reaching fruition now that I just wanted to highlight for the group.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Daniel. All right. I don't know if we have another minute left, but any other thoughts on what we need to do in the next 5 years?
If we build on this network of networks idea, I mean, the other way to think about this is we've got a lot of large systems that have electronic health records that actually could be networks themselves, right? Kaiser's already done this with vaccines in the past and with some other things. I mean, Epic really has a huge footprint across the U.S., rural, even, although concentrated in academic health centers. So if you think about that, that's the sort of network. Then what things need to sit on top of that to activate that, either in the short term or in the long term? And so it would be some of the boring things too, like contracting, common IRB, how the payments flow, whether there's research staff to do the things that would be required. All of those things then become the layer that needs to get addressed. So that would be a way to practically make some progress. It sounds a little PCORI-like, but PCORI hasn't gotten sort of this far yet to do something at that scale.
So I sense from the group that Clay is kind of focusing in on maybe our single largest area of agreement, that trying to develop sort of this network of networks, as Clay has talked about. As Steve has suggested, following down the lines that Janet has laid out for us. Am I sensing that correctly from the group?
Can I make one quick comment about that?
Yes,
So,
please.
I like the idea because I think it's efficient, but I just would want us to be mindful of potential gaps or unintended left out populations who might get where we might widen actually inequality by focusing all of our eggs in one basket.